Welcome to another treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Free to Celebrate, and it's taken from the book of Ezra, the 6th chapter, verses 13 through 22, and it's for March the 20th, 2022, spring quarter, lesson number 3. Now, a little background information. Now, to give you a quick review of our last couple of weeks of previous lessons, we remember that the Judea, they had been in a situation of apostasy, and God had declared retribution and penalty upon them. And so Babylon came down and conquered Judea and took a lot of the folks off into captivity into Babylon. And this lasted for about 70 years. And after a period of about 70 years, the Persians had begun to let some of them come back. There were several attempts to rebuild the temple during this time frame, but there was also some folks that were in the surrounding area of Jerusalem, that resisted, and they began to make complaints to the Persian government about the Jews and tried to stop the rebuilding of the temple. And that actually did happen several times where the rebuilding was stopped. And there was a search throughout the archives of both the Babylonian and the Persian Empire, and they found the original decree. And the original decree from the Persian king had given the orders to restore the temple, to rebuild the temple. And that's where we're at now, where the Persian king had reminded the folks in the surrounding area that the temple had been ordered to be rebuilt, and they were to assist any way they possibly could the Jews to rebuild that temple. And that's where we're at this point. Ezra, the 16th chapter, verses 13 and 14. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tetna, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. So we see here how that, as I said, the decree had been found, and there had been orders given for these people in the surrounding areas to assist the Jews, and them having good sense and knowing that you did not withstand the Persian king, they complied as soon as they got those very strict orders, because as we discussed last week, there was no way to misunderstand the orders that the king of Persia had sent for the surrounding areas to assist the Jews in every way possible in rebuilding that temple. And we also see here mention of the assistance that these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, had given to the rebuilding of the temple. The pulpit commentary says this: it can be well understood that Haggai's earnest exhortations, his warnings, his threats, his sarcastic reproaches, his prophecies of a coming glory to the house greater than any known previously, would rouse the spirit of the people and make them labor diligently and perseveringly. And which is the case. The work that the prophets did. For example, Haggai 1 and 4, he said, "Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin?" So in other words, they had rebuilt their own houses and had not been concerned with the temple. That's what Haggai was letting them know about. Then Haggai 1:9, "You expect much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with his own house." In other words, if you haven't been concerned about the house of God and just be doing all this other stuff, that God would penalize you for it. And these are people who are descendants of folks who had lived any way they wanted to, and God sent the Babylonian king down there and hauled them off into captivity. So they knew that when they got a warning from God's man, it was to be taken seriously. And they did. Haggai 2 and 9, "The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty." So we see here that's where Haggai is telling them that that the glory of this rebuilt temple was going to be phenomenal. It'll be something that they would be really pleased with and that they would really enjoy and something they could take great pride in. Okay? Okay. Ezra 6:15 and 16. "The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the rest of the exiles, celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy." And we see here how that the temple had been completed and how that they made a big celebration. But now, I want us to really appreciate, and I want to really appreciate how much of an effort and how long it took them to rebuild that temple. And this is what the pulpit commentary says. Ezra here gives the exact day of the completion from Zerubbabel's laying of the foundation, which was in Ezra 3 and 10. The time had elapsed was 21 years. So it took them from the time that they laid the foundation to the time of the completion, it took them 21 years to get that temple rebuilt. It was a very big deal. People that were young folks when it got started, they were middle-aged when it got finished. Okay? And it took them from the time that the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, were encouraging them, it still took another 2.5 years to get that temple rebuilt. It was a very big deal. It was a lengthy undertaking. And sometimes we will be called to take these lengthy undertakings. I went in yesterday and went to the church where First Pentecostal Church I had joined in my life when I was about 19, 20 years old, somewhere around in there. As you can tell, those of you that are watching on YouTube, you can tell how when me being 19 or 20 was a good number of years ago. And they have went through building and remodeling and building and remodeling. And I was just very pleasantly surprised and when I saw the church house, because I remember when it was just we were all sitting in this regular chair, these little stadium chairs, and the roof fell in one time. The place burnt down once. It was just like a big, long, drawn out thing. And it's taken that length of time to get that building to be so very, very, very pretty like it is now. And sometimes it takes that. The Cathedral of Notre Dame, if I remember right, it took over 100 years to build that building. And it broke my heart to sit there and to see it on news, to see that building burned to the ground. I mean, that's the birthplace of Western music, is Notre Dame. I mean, that's where Palestrina and Lazarus and those guys that are really pretty much will help define what we consider to be modern music. They help define some of those basic principles from the and to see that building burn was just heartbreaking. I hope and pray to God they get it built back. Okay. Now, Ezra 6 and 17, for the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 500 male lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Now, looking back and thinking about the captivity, and that was the people of Judea, that was primarily the people of descendants of Jude and Benjamin. They were primarily that made that up, but they were also from all 12 tribes that had been displaced during the Assyrian attack. Before that, they were other people who came back. Tribes of Benjamin and Judah, with the priests and Levites, formed the bulk of the people, yet many from the other tribes had returned with them from captivity. That's what the pulpit commentary says. Okay. Now, Ezra 6 and 18, and they installed the priests in their divisions and Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. Now, the book of Moses is very specific about the order, the priesthood, and that kind of thing. But I do want to make mention, when it talks about the division of the groups of the Levites, that was primarily something that David had instituted. First Chronicles 23 and 6 is where he did that. It reads, David separated the Levites into divisions according to the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And, and that's where he also set up the musicians. They actually had a very specific place inside the temple. Ezra 6, 19 and 20. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all of the exiles, for their relatives, the priest, and for themselves. Now, it's important for us to really stop and think about this, how that it's a very specific, very ceremonially important Passover that happens here. And there are a few of them in the Bible that are discussed like this. And Ezra puts this one up with those other ones. There was, of course, the one in 726 BC that was held by King Hezekiah, and that's recorded in 2 Chronicles 31 through 27. Then there's another one that was held by Josiah in BC 624, and that's recorded in 2 Chronicles 35, 1 through 27. And both of these were celebrated and noted in a very special way because they were followed by a cleansing of the temple and a restoration of the temple worship after a period it had been suspended. In Ezra, Brother Ezra puts this one that they just have right here we're talking about today in the same category, and that's, of course, was in BC 516. After that temple was rebuilt and they had been restored back from the captivity, and Ezra wanted to make sure that he very specifically mentioned that. Okay? Now, Ezra 6:21 and 22. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. And it's important, I guess, for us to notice that the king of Persia is also called the king of Assyria here. And because the how that God had worked a miracle, and it includes all 12 tribes. There were some of the other tribes who came back during this time period. I also, too, want to make note of the fact that in Exodus 12 and 48, a foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males of his household circumcised, then he may take part like one in the land, born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat it. So these Gentiles that were allowed to participate in the Passover were fully converted. They were proselytized. They were converted to being spiritual Jews and had turned their back on their idolatry, that were allowed to participate in this Passover. Okay? Now, let's talk about a few things in conclusion. Now, I want to really emphasize how that this is a story that is long and drawn out. From the time that Nebuchadnezzar came down and destroyed that temple, those people were in captivity, fully in captivity, for 70 years. And it took them, after they were being restored, it took them 21 years to rebuild that temple. But they held on. They kept pressing forward. They kept pressing on to the high mark. They kept the struggle going. And there are times in our lives when we will be faced with situations, and we have to make sure that we keep going, we keep heading toward that mark. Don't give up, don't let up, keeps the struggle going. And there are times where we have to do that. And if we keep hanging on and holding on and going on, the victory will eventually be ours. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.